Chapter 36. What is it? For a long and weary hour we tramped over this great bed of bones. We advanced regardless of everything, drawn on by ardent curiosity. What other marvels did this great cavern contain? What other wondrous treasures for the scientific man? My eyes were quite prepared for any number of surprises. My imagination lived in expectation of something new and wonderful. The borders of the great central ocean had for some time disappeared behind the hills that were scattered over the ground occupied by the plain of bones. The imprudent and enthusiastic professor, who did not care whether he lost himself or not, hurried me forward. We advanced silently, bathed in waves of electric fluid. By reason of a phenomenon which I cannot explain, and thanks to its extreme diffusion, now complete, the light illumined equally the sides of every hill and rock. Its seat appeared to be nowhere, in no determined force, and produced no shade whatever. The appearance presented was that of a tropical country at midday in summer in the midst of the equatorial regions and under the vertical rays of the sun. All signs of vapor had disappeared. The rocks, the distant mountains, some confused masses of far-off forests, assumed a weird and mysterious aspect under this equal distribution of the luminous fluid. We resembled, to a certain extent, the mysterious personage in one of Hoffmann's fantastic tales, The Man Who Lost His Shadow. After we had walked about a mile farther, we came to the edge of a vast forest, not, however, one of the vast mushroom forests we had discovered near Port Gretchen. It was the glorious and wild vegetation of the Tertiary period, in all its superb magnificence. Huge palms of a species now unknown, superb palmacites, a genus of fossil palms from the coal formation pines, yews, cypress and conifers or cone-bearing trees, the whole bound together by an inextricable and complicated mass of creeping plants. A beautiful carpet of mosses and ferns grew beneath the trees. Pleasant brooks murmured beneath umbrageous boughs, little worthy of this name, for no shade did they give. Upon their borders grew small tree-like shrubs, such as are seen in the hot countries on our own inhabited globe. The one thing wanting in these plants, these shrubs, these trees was color. Forever deprived of the vivifying warmth of the sun, they were vapid and colorless. All shade was lost in one uniform tint, of a brown and faded character. The leaves were wholly devoid of verdure, and the flowers, so numerous during the Tertiary period which gave them birth, were without color and without perfume, something like paper discolored by long exposure to the atmosphere. My uncle ventured beneath the gigantic groves. I followed him, though not without a certain amount of apprehension. Since nature had shown herself capable of producing such stupendous vegetable supplies, why might we not meet with mammals just as large, and therefore dangerous? I particularly remarked, in the clearings left by trees that had fallen and been partially consumed by time, many leguminous bean-like shrubs, such as the maple and other eatable trees, dear to ruminating animals. Then there appeared confounded together and intermixed, the trees of such varied lands, specimens of the vegetation of every part of the globe. There was the oak near the palm tree, the Australian eucalyptus, an interesting class of the order Myrtaceae, leaning against the tall Norwegian pine. The poplar of the north, mixing its branches with those of the New Zealand chorus. It was enough to drive the most ingenious classifier of the upper regions out of his mind, and to upset all his received ideas about botany. Suddenly I stopped short and restrained my uncle. The extreme diffuseness of the light enabled me to see the smallest objects in the distant copses. I thought I saw I really did see with my own eyes immense, gigantic animals moving about under the mighty trees. Yes, they were truly gigantic animals, a whole herd of mastodons, not fossils, but living, and exactly like those discovered in 1801 on the marshy banks of the Great Ohio in North America. Yes, I could see these enormous elephants, whose trunks were tearing down large boughs and working in and out the trees like a legion of serpents. I could hear the sounds of the mighty tusks uprooting huge trees. The boughs crackled, and the whole masses of leaves and green branches went down the capacious throats of these terrible monsters. That wondrous dream, when I saw the ante-historical times revivified, when the Tertiary and Quaternary periods passed before me, was now realized. And there we were alone, far down in the bowels of the earth, at the mercy of its ferocious inhabitants. My uncle paused, full of wonder and astonishment. "Come," he said at last, when his first surprise was over, "come along, my boy, and let us see them nearer." "No," replied I, restraining his efforts to drag me forward. "We are wholly without arms. What should we do in the midst of that flock of gigantic quadrupeds? Come away, uncle, I implore you. No human creature can with impunity brave the ferocious anger of these monsters." "No human creature," said my uncle, suddenly lowering his voice to a mysterious whisper. "You are mistaken, my dear Henry. Look yonder. It seems to me that I behold a human being, a being like ourselves, a man." I looked, shrugging my shoulders, decided to push incredulity to its very last limits. But whatever might have been my wish, I was compelled to yield to the weight of ocular demonstration. Yes, not more than a quarter of a mile off, leaning against the trunk of an enormous tree, was a human being, a Proteus of these subterranean regions, a new son of Neptune keeping this innumerable herd of mastodons. Immanis pecoris custos, immenere ipsi. The keeper of gigantic cattle, himself still more gigantic. Yes, it was no longer a fossil, whose corpse we had raised from the ground in the great cemetery, but a giant capable of guiding and driving these prodigious monsters. His height was above 12 feet. His head, as big as the head of a buffalo, was lost in a mane of matted hair. It was indeed a huge mane, like those which belonged to the elephants of the earlier ages of the world. In his hand was a branch of a tree, which served as a crook for this antediluvian shepherd. We remained profoundly still, speechless with surprise. But we might at any moment be seen by him. Nothing remained for us but instant flight. "Come, come," I cried, dragging my uncle along, and, for the first time, he made no resistance to my wishes. A quarter of an hour later, we were far away from that terrible monster. Now that I think of the matter calmly, and that I reflect upon it dispassionately now that months, years have passed since this strange and unnatural adventure befell us, what am I to think? What am I to believe? No, it is utterly impossible. Our ears must have deceived us, and our eyes have cheated us. We have not seen what we believed we had seen. No human being could by any possibility have existed in that subterranean world. No generation of men could inhabit the lower caverns of the globe without taking note of those who peopled the surface, without communication with them. It was folly, 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 nothing else. I am rather inclined to admit the existence of some animal resembling in structure the human race of some monkey of the first geological epochs, like that discovered by M. Lartet in the ossiferous deposit of Sanson. But this animal or being, whichsoever it was, surpassed in height all things known to modern science. Never mind. However unlikely it may be, it might have been a monkey, but a man, a living man, and with him a whole generation of gigantic animals, buried in the entrails of the earth. It was too monstrous to be believed. Chapter 37. The Mysterious Dagger. During this time we had left the bright and transparent forest far behind us. We were mute with astonishment, overcome by a kind of feeling which was next door to apathy. We kept running in spite of ourselves. It was a perfect right, which resembled one of those horrible sensations we sometimes meet with in our dreams. Instinctively we made our way towards the Central Sea, and I cannot now tell what wild thoughts passed through my mind, nor of what follies I might have been guilty, but for a very serious preoccupation which brought me back to practical life. Though I was aware that we were treading on a soil quite new to us, I, however, every now and then noticed certain aggregations of rock, the shape of which forcibly reminded me of those near Port Gretchen. This confirmed, moreover, the indications of the compass and our extraordinary and unlooked for, as well as involuntary, return to the north of this great Central Sea. It was so like our starting point that I could scarcely doubt the reality of our position. Streams and cascades fell in hundreds over the numerous projections of the rocks. I actually thought I could see our faithful and monotonous Hans and the wonderful grotto in which I had come back to life after my tremendous fall. Then, as we advanced still farther, the position of the cliffs, the appearance of a stream, the unexpected profile of a rock, threw me again into a state of bewildering doubt. After some time I explained my state of mental indecision to my uncle. He confessed to a similar feeling of hesitation. He was totally unable to make up his mind in the midst of this extraordinary but uniform panorama. There can be no doubt, I insisted, that we have not landed exactly at the place whence we first took our departure, but the tempest has brought us above our starting point. I think, therefore, that if we follow the coast we shall once more find Port Gretchen." "In that case," cried my uncle, "it is useless to continue our exploration. The very best thing we can do is to make our way back to the raft. Are you quite sure, Harry, that you are not mistaken?" "It is difficult," was my reply, "to come to any decision, for all these rocks are exactly alike. There is no marked difference between them. At the same time, the impression on my mind is that I recognize the promontory at the foot of which our worthy Hans constructed the raft. We are, I am nearly convinced, near the little port, if this be not it," I added, carefully examining a creek which appeared singularly familiar to my mind. "My dear Harry, if this were the case, we should find traces of our own footsteps, some signs of our passage, and I can really see nothing to indicate our having passed this way." "But I see something," I cried, in an impetuous tone of voice, as I rushed forward and eagerly picked up something which shone in the sand under my feet. "What is it?" cried the astonished and bewildered professor. This was my reply, and I handed to my startled relative a rusty dagger of singular shape. "What made you bring with you so useless a weapon?" he exclaimed. "It was needlessly hampering yourself." "I bring it? It is quite new to me. I never saw it before. Are you sure it is not out of your collection?" "Not that I know of," said the professor, puzzled. "I have no recollection of the circumstance. It was never my property." "This is very extraordinary," I said, musing over the novel and singular incident. "Not at all. There is a very simple explanation, Harry. The Icelanders are known to keep up the use of these antiquated weapons, and this must have belonged to Hans, who has let it fall without knowing it." I shook my head. That dagger had never been in the possession of the pacific and taciturn Hans. I knew him and his habits too well. Then, what can it be, unless it be the weapon of some antediluvian warrior? I continued, of some living man, a contemporary of that mighty shepherd from whom we have just escaped. But no mystery upon mystery, this is no weapon of the stony epoch, nor even of the bronze period. It is made of excellent steel. Ere I could finish my sentence, my uncle stopped me short from entering upon a whole train of theories, and spoke in his most cold and decided tone of voice. "Calm yourself, my dear boy, and endeavor to use your reason. This weapon, upon which we have fallen so unexpectedly, is a true dague, one of those worn by gentlemen in their belts during the 16th century. Its use was to give the coup de grace, the final blow, to the foe who would not surrender. It is clearly of Spanish workmanship. It belongs neither to you, nor to me, nor the eider-down hunter, nor to any of the living beings who may still exist so marvelously in the interior of the earth." "What can you mean, uncle?" I said, now lost in a host of surmises. "Look closely at it," he continued. "These jagged edges were never made by the resistance of human blood and bone. The blade is covered with a regular coating of iron mold and rust, which is not a day old, not a year old, not a century old, but much more." The professor began to get quite excited, according to custom, and was allowing himself to be carried away by his fertile imagination. I could have said something. He stopped me. "Harry, he cried, "we are now on the verge of a great discovery. This blade of a dagger you have so marvelously discovered, after being abandoned upon the sand for more than 100, 200, even 300 years, has been indented by someone endeavoring to carve an inscription on these rocks." "But this poniard never got here of itself," I exclaimed. "It could not have twisted itself. Someone, therefore, must have preceded us upon the shores of this extraordinary sea." "Yes, a man. But what man has been sufficiently desperate to do such a thing? A man who has somewhere written his name with this very dagger, a man who has endeavored once more to indicate the right road to the interior of the earth. Let us look around, my boy. You know not the importance of your singular and happy discovery." Prodigiously interested, we walked along the wall of rock, examining the smallest fissures, which might finally expand into the much wished-for gully or shaft. We at last reached a spot where the shore became extremely narrow. The sea almost bathed the foot of the rocks, which were here very lofty and steep. There was scarcely a path wider than 2 yards at any point. At last, under a huge overhanging rock, we discovered the entrance of a dark and gloomy tunnel. There, on a square tablet of granite, which had been smoothed by rubbing it with another stone, we could see two mysterious and much worn letters, the two initials of the bold and extraordinary traveler who had preceded us on our adventurous journey. S, cried my uncle. You see, I was right. Arn Saknussemm, always Arn Saknussemm. Chapter 38. No Outlet Blasting the Rock. Ever since the commencement of our marvelous journey, I had experienced many surprises, had suffered from many illusions. I thought that I was case-hardened against all surprises, and could neither see nor hear anything to amaze me again. I was like a many who, having been round the world, finds himself wholly blasé-proof against the marvelous. When, however, I saw these two letters which had been engraven 300 years before, I stood fixed in an attitude of mute surprise. Not only was there the signature of the learned and enterprising alchemist written in the rock, but I held in my hand the very identical instrument with which he had laboriously engraved it. It was impossible, without showing an amount of incredulity scarcely becoming a sane man, to deny the existence of the traveler, and the reality of that voyage which I believed all along to have been a myth, the mystification of some fertile brain. While these reflections were passing through my mind, my uncle, the professor, gave way to an access of feverish and poetical excitement. Wonderful and glorious genius, great Saknussemm, he cried, you have left no stone unturned, no resource omitted, to show to other mortals the way into the interior of our mighty globe, and your fellow creatures can find the trail left by your illustrious footsteps, 300 years ago, at the bottom of these obscure subterranean abodes. You have been careful to secure for others the contemplation of these wonders and marvels of creation. Your name engraved at every important stage of your glorious journey leads the hopeful traveler direct to the great and mighty discovery to which you devoted such energy and courage. The audacious traveler, who shall follow your footsteps to the last, will doubtless find your initials engraved with your own hand upon the center of the earth. I will be that audacious traveler. I, too, will sign my name upon the very same spot, upon the central granite stone of this wondrous work of the Creator. But in justice to your devotion, to your courage, and to your being the first to indicate the road, let this cape, seen by you upon the shores of this sea discovered by you, be called, of all time, Cape Saknussemm. This is what I heard, and I began to be roused to the pitch of enthusiasm indicated by those words. A fierce excitement roused me. I forgot everything. The dangers of the voyage and the perils of the return journey were now as nothing. What another man had done in ages past could, I felt, be done again. I was determined to do it myself, and now nothing that man had accomplished appeared to me impossible. Forward, forward, I cried in a burst of genuine and hearty enthusiasm. I had already started in the direction of the somber and gloomy gallery when the professor stopped me. He, the man so rash and hasty, he, the man so easily roused to the highest pitch of enthusiasm, checked me and asked me to be patient and show more calm. Let us return to our good friend, Hans, he said. We will then bring the raft down to this place. I must say that though I at once yielded to my uncle's request, it was not without dissatisfaction, and I hastened along the rocks of that wonderful coast. Do you know, my dear uncle, I said, as we walked along, that we have been singularly helped by a concurrence of circumstances right up to this very moment. So you begin to see it, do you, Harry, said the professor with a smile. Doubtless. I responded, and strangely enough. Even the tempest has been the means of putting us on the right road. Blessings on the tempest. It brought us safely back to the very spot from which fine weather would have driven us forever. Supposing we had succeeded in reaching the southern and distant shores of this extraordinary sea, what would have become of us? The name of Saknussemm would never have appeared to us, and at this moment we should have been cast away upon an inhospitable coast, probably without an outlet. Yes, Harry, my boy, there is certainly something providential in that wandering at the mercy of wind and waves towards the south we have come back exactly north, and what is better still, we fall upon this great discovery of Cape Saknussemm. I mean to say, that it is more than surprising. There is something in it which is far beyond my comprehension. The coincidence is unheard of, marvelous. What matter? It is not our duty to explain facts, but to make the best possible use of them. Doubtless, my boy. But if you will allow me, said the really delighted professor. Excuse me, sir, but I see exactly how it will be. We shall take the northern route. We shall pass under the northern regions of Europe, under Sweden, under Russia, under Siberia, and who knows where, instead of burying ourselves under the burning plains and deserts of Africa, or beneath the mighty waves of the ocean, and that is all, at this stage of our journey, that I care to know. Let us advance, and heaven will be our guide. Yes, Harry, you are right, quite right, all is for the best. Let us abandon this horizontal sea, which could never have led to anything satisfactory. We shall descend, descend, and everlastingly descend. Do you know, my dear boy, that to reach the interior of the earth we have only 5,000 miles to travel? Bah, I cried, carried away by a burst of enthusiasm. The distance is scarcely worth speaking about. The thing is to make a start. My wild, mad, and incoherent speeches continued until we rejoined our patient and phlegmatic guide. All was, we found, prepared for an immediate departure. There was not a single parcel but what was in its proper place. We all took up our posts on the raft, and the sail being hoisted, Hans received his directions, and guided the frail bark towards Cape Saknussemm, as we had definitely named it. The wind was very unfavorable to a craft that was unable to sail close to the wind. It was constructed to go before the blast. We were continually reduced to pushing ourselves forward by means of poles. On several occasions the rocks ran far out into deep water, and we were compelled to make a long round. At last, after 3 long and weary hours of navigation, that is to say, about 6 o'clock in the evening, we found a place at which we could land. I jumped on shore first. In my present state of excitement and enthusiasm, I was always first. My uncle and the Icelander followed. The voyage from the port to this point of the sea had by no means calmed me. It had rather produced the opposite effect. I even proposed to burn our vessel, that is, to destroy our raft, in order to completely cut off our retreat. But my uncle sternly opposed this wild project. I began to think him particularly lukewarm and unenthusiastic. At any rate, my dear uncle, I said, let us start without delay. Yes, my boy, I am quite as eager to do so as you can be. But, in the first place, let us examine this mysterious gallery, in order to find if we shall need to prepare and mend our ladders. My uncle now began to see to the efficiency of our Ruhmkorff coil, which would doubtless soon be needed. The raft, securely fastened to a rock, was left alone. Moreover, the opening into the new gallery was not 20 paces distant from the spot. Our little troop, with myself at the head, advanced. The orifice, which was almost circular, presented a diameter of about 5 feet. The somber tunnel was cut in the living rock and coated on the inside by the different material which had once passed through it in a state of fusion. The lower part was about level with the water, so that we were able to penetrate to the interior without difficulty. We followed an almost horizontal direction when, at the end of about a dozen paces, our further advance was checked by the interposition of an enormous block of granite rock. "Accursed stone!" I cried furiously, on perceiving that we were stopped by what seemed an insurmountable obstacle. In vain we looked to the right, in vain we looked to the left, in vain examined it above and below. There existed no passage, no sign of any other tunnel. I experienced the most bitter and painful disappointment. So enraged was I that I would not admit the reality of any obstacle. I stooped to my knees. I looked under the mass of stone. No hole, no interstice. I then looked above. The same barrier of granite. Hans, with the lamp, examined the sides of the tunnel in every direction. But all in vain. It was necessary to renounce all hope of passing through. I had seated myself upon the ground. My uncle walked angrily and hopelessly up and down. He was evidently desperate. But I cried, after some moments' thought, what about Arne Saknussemm? You are right, replied my uncle. He can never have been checked by a lump of rock. No, 10,000 times no, I cried, with extreme vivacity. This huge lump of rock, in consequence of some singular concussion or process, one of those magnetic phenomena which have so often shaken the terrestrial crust, has in some unexpected way closed up the passage. Many and many years have passed away since the return of Saknussemm, and the fall of this huge block of granite. Is it not quite evident that this gallery was formerly the outlet for the pent-up lava in the interior of the earth, and that these eruptive matters then circulated freely? Look at these recent fissures in the granite roof. It is evidently formed of pieces of enormous stone placed here as if by the hand of a giant who had worked to make a strong and substantial arch. One day, after an unusually strong shock, the vast rock which stands in our way, and which was doubtless the key of a kind of arch, fell through to a level with the soil and has barred our further progress. We are right, then, in thinking that this is an unexpected obstacle, with which Saknussemm did not meet, and if we do not upset it in some way, we are unworthy of following in the footsteps of the great discoverer and incapable of finding our way to the center of the earth. In this wild way I address my uncle. The zeal of the professor, his earnest longing for success, had become part and parcel of my being. I wholly forgot the past, I utterly despised the future. Nothing existed for me upon the surface of this spheroid in the bosom of which I was engulfed. No towns, no country, no Hamburg, no Königstrasse, not even my poor Gretchen, who by this time would believe me utterly lost in the interior of the earth. "Well," cried my uncle, roused to enthusiasm by my words, "let us go to work with pickaxes, with crowbars, with anything that comes to hand, but down with these terrible walls." "It is far too tough and too big to be destroyed by a pickaxe or crowbar," I replied. "What then?" "As I said, it is useless to think of overcoming such a difficulty by means of ordinary tools." "What then?" "What else but gunpowder, a subterranean mine. Let us blow up the obstacle that stands in our way." "Gunpowder." "Yes, all we have to do is to get rid of this paltry obstacle." "To work, Hans, to work," cried the professor. The Icelander went back to the raft and soon returned with a huge crowbar, with which he began to dig a hole in the rock, which was to serve as a mine. It was by no means a slight task. It was necessary for our purpose to make a cavity large enough to hold 50 pounds of fulminating gun cotton, the expansive power of which is 4 times as great as that of ordinary gunpowder. I had now roused myself to an almost miraculous state of excitement. While Hans was at work, I actively assisted my uncle to prepare a long wick, made from damp gunpowder, the mass of which we finally enclosed in a bag of linen. "We are bound to go through," I cried, enthusiastically. "We are bound to go through," responded the professor, tapping me on the back. At midnight, our work as miners was completely finished. The charge of fulminating cotton was thrust into the hollow, and the match, which we had made of considerable length, was ready. A spark was now sufficient to ignite this formidable engine and to blow the rock to atoms. We will now rest until tomorrow. It was absolutely necessary to resign myself to my fate and to consent to wait for the explosion for 6 weary hours. Chapter 39. The explosion and its results. The next day, which was the 27th of August, was a date celebrated in our wondrous subterranean journey. I never think of it even now, but I shudder with horror. My heart beats wildly at the very memory of that awful day. From this time forward, our reason, our judgment, our human ingenuity have nothing to do with the course of events. We are about to become the plaything of the great phenomena of the earth. At 6 o'clock we were all up and ready. The dreaded moment was arriving when we were about to seek an opening into the interior of the earth by means of gunpowder. What would be the consequences of breaking through the crust of the earth? I begged that it might be my duty to set fire to the mine. I looked upon it as an honor. This task once performed, I could rejoin my friends upon the raft, which had not been unloaded. As soon as we were all ready, we were to sail away to some distance to avoid the consequences of the explosion, the effects of which would certainly not be concentrated in the interior of the earth. The slow match we calculated to burn for about 10 minutes, more or less, before it reached the chamber in which the great body of powder was confined. I should therefore have plenty of time to reach the raft and put off to a safe distance. I prepared to execute my self-allotted task not, it must be confessed, without considerable emotion. After a hearty repast, my uncle and the hunter guide embarked on board the raft, while I remained alone upon the desolate shore. I was provided with a lantern which was to enable me to set fire to the wick of the infernal machine. "Go, my boy," said my uncle, "and heaven be with you. But come back as soon as you can. I shall be all impatience." "Be easy on that matter," I replied. "There is no fear of my delaying on the road." Having said this, I advanced toward the opening of the somber gallery. My heart beat wildly. I opened my lantern and seized the extremity of the wick. The professor, who was looking on, held his chronometer in his hand. "Are you ready?" cried he. "Quite ready." "Well, then, fire away." I hastened to put the light to the wick, which crackled and sparkled, hissing and spitting like a serpent. Then, running as fast as I could, I returned to the shore. "Get on board, my lad, and you, Hans, shove off," cried my uncle. By a vigorous application of his pole, Hans sent us flying over the water. The raft was quite 20 fathoms distant. It was a moment of palpitating interest, of deep anxiety. My uncle, the professor, never took his eyes off the chronometer. "Only 5 minutes more," he said in a low tone. "Only 4, only 3. My pulse went 100 to the minute. I could hear my heart beating. "Only 2, 1. Now then, mountains of granite crumble beneath the power of man." What happened after that? As to the terrific roar of the explosion, I do not think I heard it, but the form of the rocks completely changed in my eyes. They seemed to be drawn aside like a curtain. I saw a fathomless, a bottomless abyss, which yawned beneath the turgid waves. The sea, which seemed suddenly to have gone mad, then became one great mountainous mass, upon the top of which the raft rose perpendicularly. We were all thrown down. In less than a second the light gave place to the most profound obscurity. Then I felt all solid support give way, not to my feet, but to the raft itself. I thought it was going bodily down a tremendous well. I tried to speak, to question my uncle. Nothing could be heard but the roaring of the mighty waves. We clung together in utter silence. Despite the awful darkness, despite the noise, the surprise, the emotion, I thoroughly understood what had happened. Beyond the rock which had been blown up, there existed a mighty abyss. The explosion had caused a kind of earthquake in this soil, broken by fissures and rents. The gulf, thus suddenly thrown open, was about to swallow the inland sea which, transformed into a mighty torrent, was dragging us with it. Only one idea filled my mind. We were utterly and completely lost. 1 hour, 2 hours, what more I cannot say, passed in this manner. We sat close together, elbow touching elbow, knee touching knee. We held one another's hands not to be thrown off the raft. We were subjected to the most violent shocks, whenever our sole dependence, a frail wooden raft, struck against the rocky sides of the channel. Fortunately for us, these concussions became less and less frequent, which made me fancy that the gallery was getting wider and wider and wider. There could be now no doubt that we had chanced upon the road once followed by Saknussemm, but instead of going down in a proper manner, we had, through our own imprudence, drawn a whole sea with us. These ideas presented themselves to my mind in a very vague and obscure manner. I felt rather than reasoned. I put my ideas together only confusedly, while spinning along like a man going down a waterfall. To judge by the air which, as it were, whipped my face, we must have been rushing at a perfectly lightning rate. To attempt, under these circumstances, to light a torch was simply impossible, and the last remains of our electric machine, of our Ruhmkorff coil, had been destroyed during the fearful explosion. I was therefore very much confused to see at last a bright light shining close to me. The calm countenance of the guide seemed to gleam upon me. The clever and patient hunter had succeeded in lighting the lantern, and though, in the keen and thorough draught, the flame flickered and vacillated and was nearly put out, it served partially to dissipate the awful obscurity. The gallery into which we had entered was very wide. I was, therefore, quite right in that part of my conjecture. The insufficient light did not allow us to see both of the walls at the same time. The slope of waters which was carrying us away was far greater than that of the most rapid river of America. The whole surface of the stream seemed to be composed of liquid arrows, darted forward with extreme violence and power. I can give no idea of the impression it made upon me. The raft, at times caught in certain whirlpools, and rushed forward, yet turned on itself all the time. How it did not upset I shall never be able to understand. When it approached the sides of the gallery, I took care to throw upon them the light of the lantern, and I was able to judge of the rapidity of motion by looking at the projecting masses of rock, which as soon as seen were again invisible. So rapid was our progress that points of rock at a considerable distance one from the other appeared like portions of transverse lines, which enclosed us in a kind of net, like that of a line of telegraphic wires. I believe we were now going at a rate of not less than 100 miles an hour. My uncle and I looked at one another with wild and haggard eyes. We clung convulsively to the stump of the mast, which, at the moment when the catastrophe took place, had snapped short off. We turned our backs as much as possible to the wind, in order not to be stifled by a rapidity of motion which nothing human could face and live. And still the long monotonous hours went on. The situation did not change in the least, though a discovery I suddenly made seemed to complicate it very much. When we had slightly recovered our equilibrium, I proceeded to examine our cargo. I then made the unsatisfactory discovery that the greater part of it had utterly disappeared. I became alarmed and determined to discover what were our resources. My heart beat at the idea, but it was absolutely necessary to know on what we had to depend. With this view I took the lantern and looked around. Of all our former collection of nautical and philosophical instruments, there remained only the chronometer and a compass. The ladders and ropes were reduced to a small piece of rope fastened to the stump of the mast. Not a pickaxe, not a crowbar, not a hammer, and far worse than all, no food, not enough for one day. This discovery was a prelude to a certain and horrible death. Seated gloomily on the raft, clasping the stump of the mast mechanically, I thought of all I had read as to sufferings from starvation. I remembered everything that history had taught me on the subject, and I shuddered at the remembrance of the agonies to be endured. Maddened at the prospects of enduring the miseries of starvation, I persuaded myself that I must be mistaken. I examined the cracks in the raft, I poked between the joints and beams, I examined every possible hole and corner. The result was simply nothing. Our stock of provisions consisted of nothing but a piece of dry meat and some soaked and half-moldy biscuits. I gazed around me, scared and frightened. I could not understand the awful truth, and yet of what consequence was it in regard to any new danger? Supposing that we had had provisions for months, and even for years, how could we ever get out of the awful abyss into which we were being hurled by the irresistible torrent we had let loose? Why should we trouble ourselves about the sufferings and tortures to be endured from hunger when death stared us in the face under so many other swifter and perhaps even more horrid forms? It was very doubtful, under the circumstances in which we were placed, if we should have time to die of inanition. But the human frame is singularly constituted. I know not how it was, but, from some singular hallucination of the mind, I forgot the real, serious, and immediate danger to which we were exposed, to think of the menaces of the future, which appeared before us in all their naked terror. Besides, after all, suggested hope, perhaps we might finally escape the fury of the raging torrent, and once more revisit the glimpses of the moon on the surface of our beautiful Mother Earth. How was it to be done? I had not the remotest idea. Where were we to come out? No matter, so that we did. One chance in 1,000 is always a chance, while death from hunger gave us not even the faintest glimpse of hope. It left to the imagination nothing but blank horror, without the faintest chance of escape. I had the greatest mind to reveal all to my uncle, to explain to him the extraordinary and wretched position to which we were reduced, in order that, between the two, we might make a calculation as to the exact space of time which remained for us to live. It was, it appeared to me, the only thing to be done. But I had the courage to hold my tongue, to gnaw at my entrails like the Spartan boy. I wished to leave him all his coolness. At this moment, the light of the lantern slowly fell, and at last went out. The wick had wholly burnt to an end. The obscurity became absolute. It was no longer possible to see through the impenetrable darkness. There was one torch left, but it was impossible to keep it alight. Then, like a child, I shut my eyes, that I might not see the darkness. After a great lapse of time, the rapidity of our journey increased. I could feel it by the rush of air upon my face. The slope of the waters was excessive. I began to feel that we were no longer going down a slope, we were falling. I felt as one does in a dream, going down bodily, falling. I felt that the hands of my uncle and Hans were vigorously clasping my arms. Suddenly, after a lapse of time scarcely appreciable, I felt something like a shock. The raft had not struck a hard body, but had suddenly been checked in its course. A waterspout, a liquid column of water, fell upon us. I felt suffocating. I was being drowned. Still, the sudden inundation did not last. In a few seconds I felt myself once more able to breathe. My uncle and Hans pressed my arms, and the raft carried us all three away. Chapter 40. The Ape Gigands. It is difficult for me to determine what was the real time, but I should suppose by after calculation that it must have been 10 at night. I lay in a stupor, a half-dream, during which I saw visions of astounding character. Monsters of the deep were side by side with the mighty elephantine shepherd. Gigantic fish and animals seemed to form strange conjunctions. The raft took a sudden turn, whirled round, entered another tunnel, this time illumined in a most singular manner. The roof was formed of porous stalactite, through which a moonlit vapor appeared to pass, casting its brilliant light upon our gaunt and haggard figures. The light increased as we advanced, while the roof ascended until at last we were once more in a kind of water cavern, the lofty dome of which disappeared in a luminous cloud. A rugged cavern of small extent appeared to offer a halting place to our weary bodies. My uncle and the guide moved as men in a dream. I was afraid to waken them, knowing the danger of such a sudden start. I seated myself beside them to watch. As I did so, I became aware of something moving in the distance, which at once fascinated my eyes. It was floating, apparently, upon the surface of the water, advancing by means of what at first appeared paddles. I looked with glaring eyes. One glance told me that it was something monstrous. But what? What? It was the great shark crocodile of the early writers on geology. About the size of an ordinary whale, with hideous jaws and two gigantic eyes, it advanced. Its eyes fixed on me with terrible sternness. Some indefinite warning told me that it had marked me for its own. I attempted to rise to escape, no matter where, but my knees shook under me, my limbs trembled violently, I almost lost my senses. And still the mighty monster advanced. My uncle and the guide made no effort to save themselves. With a strange noise, like none other I had ever heard, the beast came on. His jaws were at least 7 feet apart, and his distended mouth looked large enough to have swallowed a boatful of men. We were about 10 feet distant when I discovered that much as his body resembled that of a crocodile, his mouth was wholly that of a shark. His twofold nature now became apparent. To snatch us up at a mouthful, it was necessary for him to turn on his back, which motion necessarily caused his legs to kick up helplessly in the air. I actually laughed, even in the very jaws of death. But next minute, with a wild cry, I darted away into the interior of the cave, leaving my unhappy comrades to their fate. This cavern was deep and dreary. After about 100 yards I paused and looked around. The whole floor, composed of sand and malachite, was strewn with bones, freshly gnawed bones of reptiles and fish, with a mixture of mammalia. My very soul grew sick as my body shuddered with horror. I had truly, according to the old proverb, fallen out of the frying pan into the fire. Some beast larger and more ferocious even than the shark crocodile inhabited this den. What could I do? The mouth of the cave was guarded by one ferocious monster. The interior was inhabited by something too hideous to contemplate. Flight was impossible. Only one resource remained, and that was to find some small hiding place to which the fearful denizens of the cavern could not penetrate. I gazed wildly around, and at last discovered a fissure in the rock, to which I rushed in the hope of recovering my scattered senses. Crouching down, I waited shivering as in an ague fit. No man is brave in presence of an earthquake, or a bursting boiler, or an exploding torpedo. I could not be expected to feel much courage in presence of the fearful fate that appeared to await me. An hour passed. I heard all the time a strange rumbling outside the cave. What was the fate of my unhappy companions? It was impossible for me to pause to inquire. My own wretched existence was all I could think of. Suddenly a groaning, as of 50 bears in a fight, fell upon my ears, hisses, spitting, moaning, hideous to hear, and then I saw. Never, were ages to pass over my head, shall I forget the horrible apparition. It was the ape gigands. 14 feet high, covered with coarse hair of a blackish brown, the hair on the arms, from the shoulder to the elbow joints, pointing downwards, while that from the wrist to the elbow pointed upwards, it advanced. Its arms were as long as its body, while its legs were prodigious. It had thick, long, and sharply pointed teeth like a mammoth saw. It struck its breast as it came on, smelling and sniffing, reminding me of the stories we read in our early childhood of giants who ate the flesh of men and little boys. Suddenly it stopped. My heart beat wildly, for I was conscious that, somehow or other, the fearful monster had smelled me out and was peering about with his hideous eyes to try and discover my whereabouts. My reading, which as a rule is a blessing, but which on this occasion seemed momentarily to prove a curse, told me the real truth. It was the ape gigans, the antediluvian gorilla. Yes, this awful monster, confined by good fortune to the interior of the earth, was the progenitor of the hideous monster of Africa. He glared wildly about, seeking something, doubtless myself. I gave myself up for lost. No hope of safety or escape seemed to remain. At this moment, just as my eyes appeared to close in death, there came a strange noise from the entrance of the cave, and turning, the gorilla evidently recognized some enemy more worthy his prodigious size and strength. It was the huge shark crocodile, which, perhaps having disposed of my friends, was coming in search of further prey. The gorilla placed himself on the defensive, and clutching a bone some 7 or 8 feet in length, a perfect club, aimed a deadly blow at the hideous beast, which reared upwards and fell with all its weight upon its adversary. A terrible combat, the details of which it is impossible to give, now ensued. The struggle was awful and ferocious. I, however, did not wait to witness the result. Regarding myself as the object of contention, I determined to remove from the presence of the victor. I slid down from my hiding place, reached the ground, and gliding against the wall, strove to gain the open mouth of the cavern. But I had not taken many steps when the fearful clamor ceased, to be followed by a mumbling and groaning which appeared to be indicative of victory. I looked back and saw the huge ape, gory with blood, coming after me with glaring eyes, with dilated nostrils that gave forth 2 columns of heated vapor. I could feel his hot and fetid breath on my neck, and with a horrid jump awoke from my nightmare sleep. Yes, it was all a dream. I was still on the raft with my uncle and the guide. The relief was not instantaneous, for under the influence of the hideous nightmare my senses had become numbed. After a while, however, my feelings were tranquilized. The first of my perceptions which returned in full force was that of hearing. I listened with acute and attentive ears. All was still as death. All I comprehended was silence. To the roaring of the waters, which had filled the gallery with awful reverberations, succeeded perfect peace. After some little time my uncle spoke, in a low and scarcely audible tone. "Harry, boy, where are you?" "I am here," was my faint rejoinder. "Well, don't you see what has happened? We are going upwards." "My dear uncle, what can you mean?" was my half-delirious reply. "Yes, I tell you, we are ascending rapidly. Our downward journey is quite checked." I held out my hand, and after some little difficulty succeeded in touching the wall. My hand was in an instant covered with blood. The skin was torn from the flesh. We were ascending with extraordinary rapidity. The torch, cried the professor. Wildly it must be lighted. Hans, the guide, after many vain efforts, at last succeeded in lighting it, and the flame, having now nothing to prevent its burning, shed a tolerably clear light. We were enabled to form an approximate idea of the truth. "It is just as I thought," said my uncle, after a moment or two of silent attention. "We are in a narrow well about 4 fathoms square. The waters of the great inland sea, having reached the bottom of the gulf, are now forcing themselves up the mighty shaft. As a natural consequence, we are being cast upon the summit of the waters." "That I can see," was my lugubrious reply, "but where will this shaft end, and to what fall are we likely to be exposed?" "Of that I am as ignorant as yourself. All I know is that we should be prepared for the worst. We are going up at a fearfully rapid rate. As far as I can judge, we are ascending at the rate of 2 fathoms a second, of 120 fathoms a minute. Or rather more than 3½ leagues an hour. At this rate, our fate will soon be a matter of certainty." "No doubt of it," was my reply. "The great concern I have now, however, is to know whether this shaft has any issue. It may end in a granite roof, in which case we shall be suffocated by compressed air or dashed to atoms against the top. I fancy, already, that the air is beginning to be close and condensed. I have a difficulty in breathing. This might be fancy, or it might be the effect of our rapid motion, but I certainly felt a great oppression of the chest. Henry, said the professor, I do believe that the situation is to a certain extent desperate. There remain, however, many chances of ultimate safety, and I have, in my own mind, been revolving them over. During your heavy but agitated sleep, I have come to this logical conclusion: whereas we may at any moment perish, so at any moment we may be saved. We need, therefore, prepare ourselves for whatever may turn up in the great chapter of accidents. But what would you have us do? I cried. Are we not utterly helpless? No. While there is life, there is hope. At all events, there is one thing we can do: eat, and thus obtain strength to face victory or death. As he spoke, I looked at my uncle with a haggard glance. I had put off the fatal communication as long as possible. It was now forced upon me, and I must tell him the truth. Still I hesitated. Eat, I said, in a deprecating tone, as if there were no hurry. Yes, and at once. I feel like a starving prisoner, he said, rubbing his yellow and shivering hands together. And, turning round to the guide, he spoke some hearty, cheering words, as I judged from his tone, in Danish. Hans shook his head in a terribly significant manner. I tried to look unconcerned. What? Cried the professor. You do not mean to say that all our provisions are lost? Yes, was my lowly spoken reply, as I held out something in my hand. This morsel of dried meat is all that remains for us three. My uncle gazed at me as if he could not fully appreciate the meaning of my words. The blow seemed to stun him by its severity. I allowed him to reflect for some moments. Well, said I, after a short pause, what do you think now? Is there any chance of our escaping from our horrible subterranean dangers? Are we not doomed to perish in the great hollows of the center of the earth? But my pertinent questions brought no answer. My uncle either heard me not, or appeared not to do so. And in this way a whole hour passed. Neither of you has cared to speak. For myself, I began to feel the most fearful and devouring hunger. My companions, doubtless, felt the same horrible tortures, but neither of them would touch the wretched morsel of meat that remained. It lay there, a last remnant of all our great preparations for the mad and senseless journey. I looked back, with wonderment, to my own folly. Fully was I aware that, despite his enthusiasm, and the ever-to-be-hated scroll of Saknussemm, my uncle should never have started on his perilous voyage. What memories of the happy past, what previsions of the horrible future, now filled my brain. Chapter 41. Hunger. Hunger, prolonged, is temporary madness. The brain is at work without its required food, and the most fantastic notions fill the mind. Hitherto I had never known what hunger really meant. I was likely to understand it now. And yet, 3 months before I could tell my terrible story of starvation, as I thought it. As a boy, I used to make frequent excursions in the neighborhood of the professor's house. My uncle always acted on system, and he believed that, in addition to the day of rest and worship, there should be a day of recreation. In consequence, I was always free to do as I liked on a Wednesday. Now, as I had a notion to combine the useful and the agreeable, my favorite pastime was bird's nesting. I had one of the best collections of eggs in all the town. They were classified and under glass cases. There was a certain wood, which by rising at early morn, and taking the cheap train, I could reach at 11 in the morning. Here I would botanize or geologize at my will. My uncle was always glad of specimens for his herbarium, and stones to examine. When I had filled my wallet, I proceeded to search for nests. After about 2 hours of hard work, I one day sat down by a stream to eat my humble but copious lunch. How the remembrance of the spiced sausage, the wheaten loaf, and the beer made my mouth water now. I would have given every prospect of worldly wealth for such a meal. But to my story. While seated thus at my leisure, I looked up at the ruins of an old castle, at no great distance. It was the remains of an historical dwelling, ivy-clad, and now falling to pieces. While looking, I saw 2 eagles circling about the summit of a lofty tower. I soon became satisfied that there was a nest. Now, In all my collection I lacked eggs of the native eagle and the large owl. My mind was made up. I would reach the summit of that tower or perish in the attempt. I went nearer and surveyed the ruins. The old staircase years before had fallen in. The outer walls were, however, intact. There was no chance that way, unless I looked to the ivy solely for support. This was, as I soon found out, futile. There remained the chimney, which still went up to the top, and had once served to carry off the smoke from every story of the tower. Up this I determined to venture. It was narrow, rough, and therefore the more easily climbed. I took off my coat and crept into the chimney. Looking up, I saw a small, light opening, proclaiming the summit of the chimney. Up I went, for some time using my hands and knees, after the fashion of a chimney sweep. It was slow work, but there being continual projections, the task was comparatively easy. In this way I reached halfway. The chimney now became narrower. The atmosphere was close, and at last, to end the matter, I stuck fast. I could ascend no higher. There could be no doubt of this, and there remained no resource but to descend and give up my glorious prey in despair. I yielded to fate and endeavored to descend, but I could not move. Some unseen and mysterious obstacle intervened and stopped me. In an instant the full horror of my situation seized me. I was unable to move either way, and was doomed to a terrible and horrible death, that of starvation. In a boy's mind, however, there is an extraordinary amount of elasticity and hope, and I began to think of all sorts of plans to escape my gloomy fate. In the first place, I required no food just at present, having had an excellent meal, and was therefore allowed time for reflection. My first thought was to try and move the mortar with my hand. Had I possessed a knife, something might have been done, but that useful instrument I had left in my coat pocket. I soon found that all efforts of this kind were vain and useless, and that all I could hope to do was to wriggle downwards. But though I jerked and struggled and strove to turn, it was all in vain. I could not move an inch, one way or the other, and time flew rapidly. My early rising probably contributed to the fact that I felt sleepy, and gradually gave way to the sensation of drowsiness. I slept, and awoke in darkness, ravenously hungry. Night had come, and still I could not move. I was tight-bound, and did not succeed in changing my position an inch. I groaned aloud. Never since the days of my happy childhood, when it was a hardship to go from meal to meal without eating, had I really experienced hunger. The sensation was as novel as it was painful. I began now to lose my head and to scream and cry out in my agony. Something appeared, startled by my noise. It was a harmless lizard, but it appeared to me a loathsome reptile. Again I made the old ruins resound with my cries, and finally so exhausted myself that I fainted. How long I lay in a kind of trance or sleep I cannot say, but when again I recovered consciousness it was day. How ill I felt, how hunger still gnawed at me, it would be hard to say. I was too weak to scream now, far too weak to struggle. Suddenly I was startled by a roar. "Are you there?" Henry said, the voice of my uncle. "Are you there, my boy?" I could only faintly respond, but I also made a desperate effort to turn. Some mortar fell. To this I owed my being discovered. When the search took place, it was easily seen that mortar and small pieces of stone had recently fallen from above. Hence my uncle's cry. "Be calm," he cried. "If we pull down the whole ruin, you shall be saved." They were delicious words, but I had little hope. Soon, however, about a quarter of an hour later, I heard a voice above me, at one of the upper fireplaces. "Are you below or above?" "Below," was my reply. In an instant a basket was lowered with milk, a biscuit, and an egg. My uncle was fearful to be too ready with his supply of food. I drank the milk first, for thirst had nearly deadened hunger. I then, much refreshed, ate my bread and hard egg. They were now at work at the wall. I could hear a pickaxe. Wishing to escape all danger from this terrible weapon, I made a desperate struggle, and the belt which surrounded my waist, and which had been hitched on a stone, gave way. I was free, and only escaped falling down by a rapid motion of my hands and knees. In 10 minutes more I was in my uncle's arms after being 2 days and nights in that horrible prison. My occasional delirium prevented me from counting time. I was weeks recovering from that awful starvation adventure, and yet what was that to the hideous sufferings I now endured? After dreaming for some time, and thinking of this and other matters, I once more looked around me. We were still ascending with fearful rapidity. Every now and then the air appeared to check our respiration as it does that of aeronauts when the ascension of the balloon is too rapid. But if they feel a degree of cold in proportion to the elevation they attain in the atmosphere, we experienced quite a contrary effect. The heat began to increase in a most threatening and exceptional manner. I cannot tell exactly the mean, but I think it must have reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit. What was the meaning of this extraordinary change in the temperature? As far as we had hitherto gone, facts had proved the theories of Davy and of Lidenbrock to be correct. Until now, all the peculiar conditions of refractory rocks, of electricity, of magnetism, had modified the general laws of nature, and had created for us a moderate temperature, for the theory of the central fire remained, in my eyes, the only explainable one. Were we, then, going to reach a position in which these phenomena were to be carried out in all their rigor, and in which the heat would reduce the rocks to a state of fusion? Such was my not unnatural fear, and I did not conceal the fact from my uncle. My way of doing so might be cold and heartless, but I could not help it. If we are not drowned or smashed into pancakes, and if we do not die of starvation, we have the satisfaction of knowing that we must be burned alive. My uncle, in presence of this brusque attack, simply shrugged his shoulders, and resumed his reflections whatever they might be. An hour passed away, and except that there was a slight increase in the temperature, no incident modified the situation. My uncle at last, of his own accord, broke silence. "Well, Henry, my boy," he said, "in a cheerful way we must make up our minds." "Make up our minds to what?" I asked, in considerable surprise. "Well, to something. We must at whatever risk recruit our physical strength. If we make the fatal mistake of husbanding our little remnant of food, we may probably prolong our wretched existence a few hours, but we shall remain weak to the end." "Yes," I growled, "to the end. That, however, will not keep us long waiting." "Well, only let a chance of safety present itself, only allow that a moment of action be necessary. Where shall we find the means of action, if we allow ourselves to be reduced to physical weakness by inanition? When this piece of meat is devoured, uncle, what hope will there remain unto us?" "None, my dear Henry, none. But will it do you any good to devour it with your eyes? You appear to me to reason like one without will or decision, like a being without energy." "Then," cried I, exasperated to a degree which is scarcely to be explained, "you do not mean to tell me that you have not lost all hope?" "Certainly not," replied the professor with consummate coolness. "You mean to tell me, uncle, that we shall get out of this monstrous subterranean shaft?" "While there is life there is hope. I beg to assert, Henry, that as long as a man's heart beats, as long as a man's flesh quivers, I do not allow that a being gifted with thought and will can allow himself to despair." What a nerve! The man placed in a position like that we occupied must have been very brave to speak like this. "Well," I cried, "what do you mean to do?" "Eat what remains of the food we have in our hands. Let us swallow the last crumb. It will bell heaven willing, our last repast." "Well, never mind, instead of being exhausted skeletons, we shall be men." "True," muttered I in a despairing tone, "let us take our fill." "We must," replied my uncle, with a deep sigh, "call it what you will." My uncle took a piece of the meat that remained, and some crusts of biscuit which had escaped the wreck. He divided the whole into 3 parts. Each had 1 pound of food to last him as long as he remained in the interior of the earth. Each now acted in accordance with his own private character. My uncle, the professor, ate greedily, but evidently without appetite, eating simply from some mechanical motion. I put the food inside my lips, and hungry as I was, chewed my morsel without pleasure, and without satisfaction. Hans, the guide, just as if he had been eider down hunting, swallowed every mouthful, as though it were a usual affair. He looked like a man equally prepared to enjoy superfluity or total want. Hans, in all probability, was no more used to starvation than ourselves, but his hardy Icelandic nature had prepared him for many sufferings. As long as he received his 3 Riksdaler every Saturday night, he was prepared for anything. The fact was, Hans never troubled himself about much except his money. He had undertaken to serve a certain man at so much per week, and no matter what evils befell his employer or himself, he never found fault or grumbled, so long as his wages were duly paid. Suddenly my uncle roused himself. He had seen a smile on the face of our guide. I could not make it out. "What is the matter?" said my uncle. "Schiedam," said the guide, producing a bottle of this precious fluid. We drank. My uncle and myself will own to our dying day that hence we derived strength to exist until the last bitter moment. That precious bottle of Hollands was in reality only half full, but, under the circumstances, it was nectar. It took some minutes for myself and my uncle to form a decided opinion on the subject. The worthy professor swallowed about half a pint and did not seem able to drink any more. "Fortreffelig," said Hans, swallowing nearly all that was left. "Excellent, very good," said my uncle, with as much gusto as if he had just left the steps of the club at Hamburg. I had begun to feel as if there had been one gleam of hope. Now all thought of the future vanished. We had consumed our last ounce of food, and it was 5 o'clock in the morning. Chapter 42. The Volcanic Shaft. Man's constitution is so peculiar that his health is purely a negative matter. No sooner is the rage of hunger appeased than it becomes difficult to comprehend the meaning of starvation. It is only when you suffer that you really understand. As to anyone who has not endured privation having any notion of the matter, it is simply absurd. With us, after a long fast, some mouthfuls of bread and meat, a little mouldy biscuit and salt beef triumphed over all our previous gloomy and saturnine thoughts. Nevertheless, after this repast each gave way to his own reflections. I wondered what were those of Hans, the man of the extreme north, who was yet gifted with the fatalistic resignation of Oriental character. But the utmost stretch of the imagination would not allow me to realize the truth. As for my individual self, my thoughts had ceased to be anything but memories of the past, and were all connected with that upper world which I never should have left. I saw it all now, the beautiful house in the Königstrasse, my poor Gretchen, the good Martha, they all passed before my mind like visions of the past. Every time any of the lugubrious groanings which were to be distinguished in the hollows around fell upon my ears, I fancied I heard the distant murmur of the great cities above my head. As for my uncle, always thinking of his science, he examined the nature of the shaft by means of a torch. He closely examined the different strata one above the other, in order to recognize his situation by geological theory. This calculation, or rather this estimation, could by no means be anything but approximate. But a learned man, a philosopher, is nothing if not a philosopher, when he keeps his ideas calm and collected, and certainly the professor possessed this quality to perfection. I heard him, as I sat in silence, murmuring words of geological science. As I understood his object and his meaning, I could not but interest myself despite my preoccupation in that terrible hour. "Eruptive granite," he said to himself, "we are still in the primitive epoch, but we are going up, still going up, but who knows, who knows?" Then he still hoped. He felt along the vertical sides of the shaft with his hand, and some few minutes later he would go on again in the following style. "This is gneiss. This is mica schist, silicious mineral. Good again, this is the epoch of transition. At all events, we are close to them, and then. What could the professor mean? Could he, by any conceivable means, measure the thickness of the crust of the earth suspended above our heads? Did he possess any possible means of making any approximation to this calculation? No. The manometer was wanting, and no summary estimation could take the place of it. And yet, as we progressed, the temperature increased in the most extraordinary degree, and I began to feel as if I were bathed in a hot and burning atmosphere. Never before had I felt anything like it. I could only compare it to the hot vapor from an iron foundry, when the liquid iron is in a state of ebullition and runs over. By degrees, and one after the other, Hans, my uncle, and myself had taken off our coats and waistcoats. They were unbearable. Even the slightest garment was not only uncomfortable, but the cause of extreme suffering. "Are we ascending to a living fire?" I cried when, to my horror and astonishment, the heat became greater than before. No, said my uncle, "it is simply impossible, quite impossible." "And yet," said I, touching the side of the shaft with my naked hand. This wall is literally burning. At this moment, feeling as I did that the sides of this extraordinary wall were red hot, I plunged my hands into the water to cool them. I drew them back with a cry of despair. "The water is boiling," I cried. My uncle, the professor, made no reply other than a gesture of rage and despair. Something very like the truth had probably struck his imagination. But I could take no share in either what was going on or in his speculations. An invincible dread had taken possession of my brain and soul. I could only look forward to an immediate catastrophe, such a catastrophe as not even the most vivid imagination could have thought of. An idea, at first vague and uncertain, was gradually being changed into certainty. I tremulously rejected it at first, but it forced itself upon me by degrees with extreme obstinacy. It was so terrible an idea that I scarcely dared to whisper it to myself. And yet all the while certain, and as it were, involuntary observations determined my convictions. By the doubtful glare of the torch, I could make out some singular changes in the granitic strata. A strange and terrible phenomenon was about to be produced, in which electricity played a part. Then this boiling water, this terrible and excessive heat. I determined as a last resource to examine the compass. The compass had gone mad. Yes, wholly stark, staring mad. The needle jumped from pole to pole with sudden and surprising jerks, ran round, or as it is said, boxed the compass, and then ran suddenly back again, as if it had the vertigo. I was aware that, according to the best acknowledged theories, it was a received notion that the mineral crust of the globe is never, and never has been, in a state of complete repose. It is perpetually undergoing the modifications caused by the decomposition of internal matter, the agitation consequent on the flowing of extensive liquid currents, the excessive action of magnetism which tends to shake it incessantly. At a time when even the multitudinous beings on its surface do not suspect the seething process to be going on. Still, this phenomenon would not have alarmed me alone, it would not have aroused in my mind a terrible, an awful idea. But other facts could not allow my self-delusion to last. Terrible detonations, like heaven's artillery, began to multiply themselves with fearful intensity. I could only compare them with the noise made by hundreds of heavily laden chariots being madly driven over a stone pavement. It was a continuous roll of heavy thunder. And then the mad compass, shaken by the wild electric phenomena, confirmed me in my rapidly formed opinion. The mineral crust was about to burst, the heavy granite masses were about to rejoin, the fissure was about to close, the void was about to be filled up, and we poor atoms to be crushed in its awful embrace. "Uncle, uncle," I cried, "we are wholly, irretrievably lost." "What, then, my young friend, is your new cause of terror and alarm?" he said in his calmest manner. "What fear you now?" "What do I fear now?" I cried in fierce and angry tones. "Do you not see that the walls of the shaft are in motion? Do you not see that the solid granite masses are cracking? Do you not feel the terrible, torrid heat? Do you not observe the awful boiling water on which we float? Do you not remark this mad needle? Every sign and portent of an awful earthquake." My uncle coolly shook his head. "An earthquake," he replied in the most calm and provoking tone. "Yes." "My nephew, I tell you that you are utterly mistaken," he continued. "Do you not, can you not, recognize all the well-known symptoms of an earthquake? By no means. I am expecting something far more important." "My brain is strained beyond endurance." "What? What do you mean?" I cried. "An eruption, Harry." "An eruption," I gasped. "We are, then, in the volcanic shaft of a crater in full action and vigor." "I have every reason to think so," said the professor in a smiling tone, "and I beg to tell you that it is the most fortunate thing that could happen to us." The most fortunate thing. Had my uncle really and truly gone mad? What did he mean by these awful words? What did he mean by this terrible calm, this solemn smile? "What? What?" cried I. In the height of my exasperation, "We are on the way to an eruption, are we? Fatality has cast us into a well of burning and boiling lava, of rocks on fire, of boiling water, in a word, filled with every kind of eruptive matter? We are about to be expelled, thrown up, vomited, spit out of the interior of the earth, in common with huge blocks of granite, with showers of cinders and scoriae, in a wild whirlwind of flame, and you say the most fortunate thing which could happen to us. Yes, replied the professor, looking at me calmly from under his spectacles, it is the only chance which remains to us of ever escaping from the interior of the earth to the light of day. It is quite impossible that I can put on paper the 1,000 strange, wild thoughts which followed this extraordinary announcement. But my uncle was right, quite right, and never had he appeared to me so audacious and so convinced as when he looked me calmly in the face and spoke of the chances of an eruption of our being cast upon Mother Earth once more through the gaping crater of a volcano. Nevertheless, while we were speaking we were still ascending. We passed the whole night going up, or to speak more scientifically, in an ascensional motion. The fearful noise redoubled. I was ready to suffocate. I seriously believed that my last hour was approaching, and yet, so strange is imagination, all I thought of was some childish hypothesis or other. In such circumstances you do not choose your own thoughts. They overcome you. It was quite evident that we were being cast upwards by eruptive matter. Under the raft there was a mass of boiling water, and under this was a heavier mass of lava, and an aggregate of rocks which, on reaching the summit of the water, would be dispersed in every direction. That we were inside the chimney of a volcano there could no longer be the shadow of a doubt. Nothing more terrible could be conceived. But on this occasion, instead of Sneffels, an old and extinct volcano, we were inside a mountain of fire in full activity. Several times I found myself asking, what mountain was it, and on what part of the world we should be shot out, as if it were of any consequence. In the northern regions there could be no reasonable doubt about that. Before it went decidedly mad, the compass had never made the slightest mistake. From the Cape of Saknussemm we had been swept away to the northward many hundreds of leagues. Now the question was, were we once more under Iceland, should we be belched forth onto the earth through the crater of Mount Hekla, or should we reappear through one of the other 7 fire funnels of the island? Taking in my mental vision a radius of 500 leagues to the westward, I could see under this parallel only the little-known volcanoes of the northwest coast of America. To the east one only existed somewhere about the 80th degree of latitude, the Esk, upon the island of Jan Mayen, not far from the frozen regions of Spitsbergen. It was not craters that were wanting, and many of them were big enough to vomit a whole army. All I wished to know was the particular one towards which we were making with such fearful velocity. I often think now of my folly, as if I should ever have expected to escape. Towards morning, the ascending motion became greater and greater. If the degree of heat increased instead of decreasing as we approached the surface of the earth, it was simply because the causes were local and wholly due to volcanic influence. Our very style of locomotion left in my mind no doubt upon the subject. An enormous force, a force of several hundreds of atmospheres produced by the vapors accumulated and long compressed in the interior of the earth, was hoisting us upwards with irresistible power. But though we were approaching the light of day, to what fearful dangers were we about to be exposed? Instant death appeared the only fate which we could expect or contemplate. Soon a dim, sepulchral light penetrated the vertical gallery, which became wider and wider. I could make out to the right and left long dark corridors like immense tunnels, from which awful and horrid vapors poured out. Tongues of fire, sparkling and crackling, appeared about to lick us up. The hour had come. "Look, uncle, look," I cried. Well, what you see are the great sulphurous flames, nothing more common in connection with an eruption. But if they lap us round, I angrily replied. They will not lap us round, was his quiet and serene answer. But it will be all the same in the end if they stifle us, I cried. We shall not be stifled. The gallery is rapidly becoming wider and wider, and if it be necessary, we will presently leave the raft and take refuge in some fissure in the rock. But the water, which is continually ascending, I despairingly replied. There is no longer any water, Harry, he answered, but a kind of lava paste, which is heaving us up, in company with itself, to the mouth of the crater. In truth, the liquid column of water had wholly disappeared to give place to dense masses of boiling eruptive matter. The temperature was becoming utterly insupportable, and a thermometer exposed to this atmosphere would have marked between 189 and 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Perspiration rushed from every pore. But for the extraordinary rapidity of our ascent, we should have been stifled. Nevertheless, the professor did not carry out his proposition of abandoning the raft, and he did quite wisely. Those few ill-joined beams offered, anyway, a solid surface of support which elsewhere must have utterly failed us. Towards 8 o'clock in the morning, a new incident startled us. The ascensional movement suddenly ceased. The raft became still and motionless. "What is the matter now?" I said, querulously, very much startled by this change. "A simple halt," replied my uncle. "Is the eruption about to fail?" I asked. "I hope not." Without making any reply, I rose. I tried to look around me. Perhaps the raft, checked by some projecting rock, opposed a momentary resistance to the eruptive mass. In this case, it was absolutely necessary to release it as quickly as possible. Nothing of the kind had occurred. The column of cinders, of scoriae, of broken rocks and earth, had wholly ceased to ascend. "I tell you, uncle, that the eruption has stopped," was my oracular decision. "Ah," said my uncle, "you think so, my boy. You are wrong. Do not be in the least alarmed. This sudden moment of calm will not last long, be assured. It has already endured 5 minutes, and before we are many minutes older, we shall be continuing our journey to the mouth of the crater." All the time he was speaking, the professor continued to consult his chronometer, and he was probably right in his prognostics. Soon the raft resumed its motion, in a very rapid and disorderly way, which lasted 2 minutes or thereabout, and then again it stopped as suddenly as before. "Good," said my uncle, observing the hour. "In 10 we shall start again." "In 10 minutes. "Yes, precisely. We have to do with a volcano, the eruption of which is intermittent. We are compelled to breathe just as it does." Nothing could be more true. At the exact minute he had indicated, we were again launched on high with extreme rapidity. Not to be cast off the raft, it was necessary to hold on to the beams. Then the hoist again ceased. Many times since have I thought of this singular phenomenon without being able to find for it any satisfactory explanation. Nevertheless, it appeared quite clear to me that we were not in the principal chimney of the volcano, but in an accessory conduit, where we felt the counter-shock of the great and principal tunnel filled by burning lava. It is impossible for me to say how many times this maneuver was repeated. All that I can remember is that on every ascensional motion, we were hoisted up with ever-increasing velocity, as if we had been launched from a huge projectile. During the sudden halts, we were nearly stifled. During the moments of projection, the hot air took away our breath. I thought for a moment of the voluptuous joy of suddenly finding myself in the Hyperborean regions with the cold 30 degrees below zero. My exalted imagination pictured to itself the vast snowy plains of the Arctic regions, and I was impatient to roll myself on the icy carpet of the North Pole. By degrees my head, utterly overcome by a series of violent emotions, began to give way to hallucination. I was delirious. Had it not been for the powerful arms of Hans, the guide, I should have broken my head against the granite masses of the shaft. I have, in consequence, kept no account of what followed for many hours. I have a vague and confused remembrance of continual detonations, of the shaking of the huge granitic mass, and of the raft going round like a spinning top. It floated on the stream of hot lava amidst a falling cloud of cinders. The huge flames roaring wrapped us around. A storm of wind which appeared to be cast forth from an immense ventilator roused up the interior fires of the earth. It was a hot, incandescent blast. At last I saw the figure of Hans as if enveloped in the huge halo of burning blaze, and no other sense remained to me but that sinister dread which the condemned victim may be supposed to feel when led to the mouth of a cannon, at the supreme moment when the shot is fired and his limbs are dispersed into empty space. Chapter 43. Daylight at last. When I opened my eyes, I felt the hand of the guide clutching me firmly by the belt. With his other hand he supported my uncle. I was not grievously wounded, but bruised all over in the most remarkable manner. After a moment I looked around, and found that I was lying down on the slope of a mountain not 2 yards from a yawning gulf into which I should have fallen had I made the slightest false step. Hans had saved me from death, while I rolled insensible on the flanks of the crater. "Where are we?" dreamily asked my uncle, who literally appeared to be disgusted at having returned to earth. The eider-down hunter simply shrugged his shoulders as a mark of total ignorance. "In Iceland," said I, not positively but interrogatively. "Nej," said Hans. "How do you mean?" cried the professor. "No, what are your reasons?" "Hans is wrong," said I, rising. After all the innumerable surprises of this journey, a yet more singular one was reserved to us. I expected to see a cone covered by snow, by extensive and widespread glaciers, in the midst of the arid deserts of the extreme northern regions, beneath the full rays of a polar sky, beyond the highest latitudes. But contrary to all our expectations, I, my uncle, and the Icelander were cast upon the slope of a mountain calcined by the burning rays of a sun which was literally baking us with its fires. I could not believe my eyes, but the actual heat which affected my body allowed me no chance of doubting. We came out of the crater half naked, and the radiant star from which we had asked nothing for 2 months was good enough to be prodigal to us of light and warmth, the light and warmth we could easily have dispensed with. When our eyes were accustomed to the light we had lost sight of so long, I used them to rectify the errors of my imagination. Whatever happened, we should have been at Spitzbergen, and I was in no humor to yield to anything but the most absolute proof. After some delay, the professor spoke. "Hem," he said, in a hesitating kind of way, "it really does not look like Iceland. But supposing it were the island of Jan Mayen, I ventured to observe." "Not in the least, my boy. This is not one of the volcanoes of the north, with its hills of granite and its crown of snow." "Nevertheless." Look, my boy," said the professor, as dogmatically as usual. Right above our heads, at a great height, opened the crater of a volcano from which escaped, from 1/4 of an hour to the other, with a very loud explosion, a lofty jet of flame mingled with pumice stone, cinders, and lava. I could feel the convulsions of nature in the mountain, which breathed like a huge whale, throwing up from time to time fire and air through its enormous vents. Below, and floating along a slope of considerable angularity, the stream of eruptive matter spread away to a depth which did not give the volcano a height of 300 fathoms. Its base disappeared in a perfect forest of green trees, among which I perceived olives, fig trees, and vines loaded with rich grapes. Certainly this was not the ordinary aspect of the Arctic regions. About that there could not be the slightest doubt. When the eye was satisfied at its glimpse of this verdant expanse, it fell upon the waters of a lovely sea, or beautiful lake, which made of this enchanted land an island of not many leagues in extent. On the side of the rising sun was to be seen a little port, crowded with houses, and near which the boats and vessels of peculiar build were floating upon azure waves. Beyond, groups of islands rose above the liquid plain, so numerous and close together as to resemble a vast beehive. Towards the setting sun, some distant shores were to be made out on the edge of the horizon. Some presented the appearance of blue mountains of harmonious conformation. Upon others, much more distant, there appeared a prodigiously lofty cone, above the summit of which hung dark and heavy clouds. Towards the north, an immense expanse of water sparkled beneath the solar rays, occasionally allowing the extremity of a mast or the convexity of a sail bellying to the wind to be seen. The unexpected character of such a scene added 100-fold to its marvelous beauties. "Where can we be?" I asked, speaking in a low and solemn voice. Hans shut his eyes with an air of indifference, and my uncle looked on without clearly understanding. "Whatever this mountain may be," he said, "at last I must confess it is rather warm. The explosions do not leave off, and I do not think it is worthwhile to have left the interior of a volcano and remain here to receive a huge piece of rock upon one's head. Let us carefully descend the mountain and discover the real state of the case. To confess the truth, I am dying of hunger and thirst." Decidedly, the professor was no longer a truly reflective character. For myself, forgetting all my necessities, ignoring my fatigues and sufferings, I should have remained still for several hours longer, but it was necessary to follow my companions. The slope of the volcano was very steep and slippery. We slid over piles of ashes, avoiding the streams of hot lava which glided about like fiery serpents. Still, while we were advancing, I spoke with extreme volubility, for my imagination was too full not to explode in words. "We are in Asia," I exclaimed. "We are on the coast of India. in the great Malay Islands, in the center of Oceania. We have crossed the one half of the globe to come out right at the antipodes of Europe." "But the compass," exclaimed my uncle. "Explained that to me." "Yes, the compass," I said with considerable hesitation. "I grant that is a difficulty. According to it, we have always been going northward." "Then it lied." "To say it lied is rather a harsh word," was my answer. "Then we are at the North Pole." "The pole, no, well, I give it up," was my reply. The plain truth was that there was no explanation possible. I could make nothing of it. And all the while we were approaching this beautiful verdure, hunger and thirst tormented me fearfully. Happily, after 2 long hours' march, a beautiful country spread out before us, covered by olives, pomegranates and vines, which appeared to belong to anybody and everybody. In any event, in the state of destitution into which we had fallen, we were not in a mood to ponder too scrupulously. What delight it was to press these delicious fruits to our lips, and to bite at grapes and pomegranates fresh from the vine. Not far off, near some fresh and mossy grass, under the delicious shade of some trees, I discovered a spring of fresh water, in which we voluptuously laved our faces, hands and feet. While we were all giving way to the delights of new-found pleasures, a little child appeared between 2 tufted olive trees. "Ah," cried I, "an inhabitant of this happy country." The little fellow was poorly dressed, weak and suffering, and appeared terribly alarmed at our appearance. Half naked, with tangled, matted and ragged beards, we did look supremely ill-favored, and unless the country was a bandit land, we were not likely to alarm the inhabitants. Just as the boy was about to take to his heels, Hans ran after him, and brought him back, despite his cries and kicks. My uncle tried to look as gentle as possible, and then spoke in German. "What is the name of this mountain, my friend?" The child made no reply. "Good," said my uncle, with a very positive air of conviction, "we are not in Germany." He then made the same demand in English, of which language he was an excellent scholar. The child shook its head and made no reply. I began to be considerably puzzled. "Is he dumb?" cried the professor, who was rather proud of his polyglot knowledge of languages, and made the same demand in French. The boy only stared in his face. "I must perforce try him in Italian," said my uncle, with a shrug. "Dove noi siamo?" "Yes, tell me where we are," I added impatiently and eagerly. Again the boy remained silent. "My fine fellow, do you or do you not mean to speak?" cried my uncle, who began to get angry. He shook him, and spoke another dialect of the Italian language. "Come si noma questa isola? What is the name of this island?" "Stromboli," replied the rickety little shepherd, dashing away from Hans and disappearing in the olive groves. We thought little enough about him. Stromboli. What effect on the imagination did these few words produce? We were in the center of the Mediterranean, amidst the eastern archipelago of mythological memory, in the ancient Strongylos, where Aeolus kept the wind and the tempest chained up, and those blue mountains, which rose towards the rising sun, were the mountains of Calabria. And that mighty volcano which rose on the southern horizon was Etna, the fierce and celebrated Etna. Stromboli, Stromboli, I repeated to myself. My uncle played a regular accompaniment to my gestures and words. We were singing together like an ancient chorus. Ah, what a journey, what a marvelous and extraordinary journey! Here we had entered the earth by one volcano, and we had come out by another, and this other was situated more than 1,200 leagues from Sneffels, from that drear country of Iceland cast away on the confines of the earth. The wondrous changes of this expedition had transported us to the most harmonious and beautiful of earthly lands. We had abandoned the region of eternal snows for that of infinite verdure, and had left over our heads the grey fog of the icy regions to come back to the azure sky of Sicily. After a delicious repast of fruits and fresh water, we again continued our journey in order to reach the port of Stromboli. To say how we had reached the island would scarcely have been prudent. The superstitious character of the Italians would have been at work, and we should have been called demons vomited from the infernal regions. It was therefore necessary to pass for humble and unfortunate shipwrecked travelers. It was certainly less striking and romantic, but it was decidedly safer. As we advanced, I could hear my worthy uncle muttering to himself. But the compass. The compass most certainly marked north. This is a fact I cannot explain in any way. Well, the fact is, said I, with an air of disdain, we must not explain anything. It will be much more easy. I should like to see a professor of the Johanneum institution who is unable to explain a cosmic phenomenon. It would indeed be strange. And speaking thus, my uncle, half naked, his leathern purse round his loins, and his spectacles upon his nose, became once more the terrible professor of mineralogy. An hour after leaving the Wood of Olives, we reached the fort of San Vicenza, where Hans demanded the price of his 13th week of service. My uncle paid him, with very many warm shakes of the hand. At that moment, if he did not indeed quite share our natural emotion, he allowed his feelings so far to give way as to indulge in an extraordinary expression for him. With the tips of 2 fingers he gently pressed our hands and smiled. Chapter 44. The journey ended. This is the final conclusion of a narrative which will be probably disbelieved even by people who are astonished at nothing. I am, however, armed at all points against human incredulity. We were kindly received by the Strombolite fishermen, who treated us as shipwrecked travelers. They gave us clothes and food. After a delay of 48 hours, on the 30th of September, a little vessel took us to Messina, where a few days of delightful and complete repose restored us to ourselves. On Friday, the 4th of October, we embarked in the Volturne, one of the postal packets of the imperial messageries of France, and 3 days later we landed at Marseilles, having no other care on our minds but that of our precious but erratic compass. This inexplicable circumstance tormented me terribly. On the 9th of October, in the evening, we reached Hamburg. What was the astonishment of Martha, what the joy of Gretchen? I will not attempt to define it. "Now then, Harry, that you really are a hero," she said, "there is no reason why you should ever leave me again." I looked at her. She was weeping tears of joy. I leave it to be imagined if the return of Professor Hardwigg made or did not make a sensation in Hamburg. Thanks to the indiscretion of Martha, the news of his departure for the interior of the earth had been spread over the whole world. No one would believe it, and when they saw him come back in safety, they believed it all the less. But the presence of Hans and many stray scraps of information by degrees modified public opinion. Then my uncle became a great man, and I the nephew of a great man, which, at all events, is something. Hamburg gave a festival in our honor. A public meeting of the Johanneum institution was held, at which the professor related the whole story of his adventures, omitting only the facts in connection with the compass. That same day he deposited in the archives of the town the document he had found written by Saknussemm, and he expressed his great regret that circumstances, stronger than his will, did not allow him to follow the Icelandic traveler's track into the very center of the earth. He was modest in his glory, but his reputation only increased. So much honor necessarily created for him many envious enemies. Of course they existed, and as his theories, supported by certain facts, contradicted the system of science upon the question of central heat, he maintained his own views both with pen and speech against the learned of every country. Although I still believe in the theory of central heat, I confess that certain circumstances, hitherto very ill-defined, may modify the laws of such natural phenomena. At the moment when these questions were being discussed with interest, my uncle received a rude shock, one that he felt very much. Hans, despite everything he could say to the contrary, quitted Hamburg. The man to whom we owed so much would not allow us to pay our deep debt of gratitude. He was taken with nostalgia, a love for his Icelandic home. "Farvel," said he one day, and with this one short word of adieu, he started for Reykjavik, which he soon reached in safety. We were deeply attached to our brave eider duck hunter. His absence will never cause him to be forgotten by those whose lives he saved, and I hope, at some not distant day, to see him again. To conclude, I may say that our journey into the interior of the earth created an enormous sensation throughout the civilized world. It was translated and printed in many languages. All the leading journals published extracts from it, which were commentated, discussed, attacked, and supported with equal animation by those who believed in its episodes, and by those who were utterly incredulous. Wonderful. My uncle enjoyed during his lifetime all the glory he deserved, and he was even offered a large sum of money by Mr. Barnum to exhibit himself in the United States, while I am credibly informed by a traveler that he is to be seen in waxwork at Madame Tussaud's. But one care preyed upon his mind, a care which rendered him very unhappy. One fact remained inexplicable, that of the compass. For a learned man to be baffled by such an inexplicable phenomenon was very aggravating. But heaven was merciful, and in the end my uncle was happy. One day, while he put some minerals belonging to his collection in order, I fell upon the famous compass and examined it keenly. For 6 months it had lain unnoticed and untouched. I looked at it with curiosity, which soon became surprise. I gave a loud cry. The professor, who was at hand, soon joined me. "What is the matter?" he cried. "The compass." "When?" "What then?" "Why, its needle points to the south and not to the north." "My dear boy, you must be dreaming." "I am not dreaming. See, the poles are changed." "Changed?" My uncle put on his spectacles, examined the instrument, and leapt with joy, shaking the whole house. A clear light fell upon our minds. "Here it is," he cried, as soon as he had recovered the use of his speech. "After we had once passed Cape Saknussemm, the needle of this compass pointed to the southward instead of the northward." Evidently. Our error is now easily explained, but to what phenomenon do we owe this alteration in the needle? Nothing more simple. Explain yourself, my boy. I am on thorns. During the storm, upon the Central Sea, the ball of fire which made a magnet of the iron in our raft turned our compass topsy-turvy. "Ah," cried the professor, with a loud and ringing laugh, "it was a trick of that inexplicable electricity." From that hour my uncle was the happiest of learned men, and I the happiest of ordinary mortals. For my pretty Verland girl, abdicating her position as ward, took her place in the house in the Königstrasse in the double quality of niece and wife. We need scarcely mention that her uncle was the illustrious Professor Hardwigg, corresponding member of all the scientific, geographical, mineralogical, and geological societies of the 5 parts of the globe. End of the voyage extraordinaire. The end. Best audiobooks for free. Hope that you have enjoyed this production of Jules Verne's Escher Journey to the Center of the Earth. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content.